In 1980, Hollywood set sail on one of the strangest, boldest, and most misunderstood voyages in movie history. Popeye, starring Robin Williams in his first ever movie role and directed by legendary director Robert Altman. It wasn't just another comic strip adaptation, it was a massive, risk-taking musical built on a full-size town filmed on the edge of the Mediterranean. Producer Robert Evans wanted it to be his own comic book franchise on the scale of Star Wars or Superman the movie, but behind the slapstick is a story of chaos, genius, big-budget battles, and some of the most unexpected creative choices ever put on film, like letting Harry Nilsson's genius go wild with the music. In this video, we're going to dive deep into how Popeye went from an ambitious dream to a cult classic film and the crazy, insane production problems, the insane Hollywood parties, and Robin Williams' own frustrating experiences, and how a movie once labeled as a flop ended up becoming one of the most fascinating oddities of the 1980s. Grab your can of spinach, tighten up your sailor's hat, and let's uncover the wild story of the 1980 film Popeye. I remember seeing this movie in the theaters when I was a little kid. And I remember just from the beginning, my 10-year-old mind being completely blown, because this was Popeye. The corncob pipe, the squinty eye, the huge forearms, and the distinctive Popeye voice.
Another thing I got is a sense of humiliation.
Robin Williams just nailed it. And the other characters were also comics accurate. Shelley Duvall as Olive Oyl, Paul Dooley as Wimpy, Paul Smith as Bluto, Ray Walston as Poop Deck Pappy. They were all great and they were right out of the cartoon. Another interesting fact was that this movie was directed by Robert Altman. Yes, Robert Altman, the legendary director who back in 1980 had just made the brilliant movie MASH. And in 1975 he made the film Nashville, and after this movie he'd go on to make The Player, Shortcuts, and Gosford Park. So it's really weird to think that Robert Altman made this movie. Apparently when this movie came out, a lot of fans of the cartoon initially complained that this movie was not accurate to the source material. But they were 100% wrong, because this movie is very accurate to the original 1920s Popeye comic strip. And the complaint was likely because many fans were only familiar with the cartoon show, and mostly they were thinking about the 1960s animated show as well as the 1980s cartoons. Because many Popeye fans had never read the original Popeye comic strip, the one created by E.C. Segar in the 1920s. Robert Altman and screenwriter Jules Feiffer were huge fans of the comic strip and created a very accurate homage, a love letter to that comic series. So the character of Popeye was actually created by cartoonist L.Z. Chrysler Segar, known as E.C. Segar, in a comic strip called Thimble Theater. And Thimble Theater started as a Sunday morning cartoon strip in 1919 and first appeared in a newspaper called the New York Journal, which was owned by a parent company called King Features, which was owned by William Randolph Hearst. And in 1919, Thimble Theater did not start with Popeye the Sailor, but rather Olive Oyl and her family. And Thimble Theater originally starred Olive Oyl and her slacker boyfriend, Harold Hamgravy. Olive also had a brother, Castor Oyl, who is in this movie. I'm telling you, screenwriter Jules Feiffer and director Robert Altman did their homework. In the comic strip, Olive's parents were Cole and Nana Oyl, and these characters were also in this movie. So you have to really understand the source material to know how deep Robert Altman and Jules Feiffer went with this movie. Now, the character of Popeye didn't make an appearance until 10 years into the comic strip. On January 17, 1929, Popeye was introduced as a minor guest character, and in the strip, Harold Hamgravy hires him as a sailor. Now, Popeye was not intended to be a regular character, but really a character for one issue. But the fan reaction to him was so great that fans kept demanding Popeye return for more adventures. Fans wanted to see more Popeye, so E.C. Segar eventually made him a regular member of the Thimble Theater cast, and eventually he became the star of the entire comic strip. And while Popeye was the star of the comic strip since the 1930s, the strip was still called Thimble Theater until 1979. But on April 23, 1979, King Features officially changed the strip's name to Popeye. E.C. Segar grew up in Chester, Illinois, and knew a lot of colorful characters growing up, which he eventually put into his comic strip. Dora Pascal ran a local food store in Chester, and she was known for being very tall and thin and always wore her hair in a bun. E.C. Segar would base the character of Olive Oyl on Dora Pascal. William Shugart was a heavy-set manager of the Chester Opera House where Segar worked. and he would be the inspiration for the hamburger-loving Wimpy. A man named Frank Rocky Fiegel was a well-known figure in Chester because he was a tough and surly man who had served as a sailor in the Merchant Marines and was known for always getting into fights, but also for having a heart of gold and always helping people in need and passing out candy to children. And Rocky worked as a local bartender, and Segar knew Rocky, and it is believed that he was the inspiration for the character of Popeye. And while Frank Rocky Fiegel was indeed likely the inspiration for Popeye, no doubt you've seen this photograph. Well, we know with 100% certainty that this is not a photo of Rocky Fiegel, but rather an unnamed British soldier. This photo, which does look like a real-life Popeye, was paired with the story of Rocky Fiegel, and it became this viral story, leading everyone on the internet to think that this is the photo of Rocky Fiegel. But it is not.
In fact, this may be the only surviving photo of the real Rocky Fiegel.
Here's something very interesting. Popeye never ate spinach in the original cartoon strip.
And spinach certainly wasn't the source of his strength. In fact, in the comic, he got his superhuman endurance and power by rubbing the feathers on the head of a magical wiffle hen named Bernice. Spinach just wasn't part of his character in the early comic strip.
Although he did eat healthy foods, and toward the end started eating a little bit of spinach for his health. However, the spinach eating didn't really occur as a character trait until much later in the Fleischer cartoons that aired in 1933 to 1942.
It was in these Fleischer cartoons where Popeye hit his next level of popularity,
when he made his debut in a series of animated cartoons in 1933. He was animated by Fleischer Studios and distributed by Paramount.
Fleischer Studios were the ones that famously illustrated the Betty Boop cartoons of the 1930s, and immediately after animating Popeye and with its success, they'd obtained the rights to animate Superman, and to this day, Fleischer Studios are best known for their Popeye and Superman cartoons.
And Popeye would star in a series of these 6-minute theatrical shorts throughout the 1930s and 40s, and even into the 50s. These were short black and white cartoons that would appear in movie theaters, and they were about 5 to 6 minutes long, and generally had the same formula. Popeye or Olive Oyl would get into some sort of trouble, usually involving Bluto. Then Popeye would eat some spinach and suddenly get strong, and his strength would get him out of the jam. His sudden buildup of strength was an interesting visual gag that worked well for cartoon animation. And so the cliche of him eating spinach
was started in the Fleischer cartoons,
not the original comic strip.
And another element that was added in the Fleischer cartoons
was the music. Popeye the Sailor Man, toot toot. That was started in these cartoons as well.
The Sailor Man, I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
So during the 1930s and 1940s, during the golden age of the rise of motion pictures and animation, these Fleischer cartoons were extremely popular, and Popeye at times was even more popular than Mickey Mouse. The next time Popeye was animated was in 1960, during the rise of the golden age of television, and Popeye became an animated cartoon series by ABC Television, and the series was called Popeye the Sailor. And this was because King Features, the people that owned Popeye, did not get to make any money off of the Paramount Fleischer cartoons, and therefore they decided to create their own cartoons for television. And you'll recognize if you've seen these cartoons, because it ran from 1960 to 1962, and 22 episodes were made. And you'll know when you see the 1960s Popeye the Sailor because the character of Bluto is named Brutus. And this is because King Features, who owned Popeye, was worried that Paramount may still own the rights to Bluto, even though they created Bluto. And they didn't want to risk a potential lawsuit with a giant like Paramount, so they simply renamed the character of Brutus, and instead of making him muscular, they kind of made him larger and fatter and gave him more of a pot belly. The funny thing is that King Features were wrong, and Paramount did not own the rights to Bluto, and King Features themselves actually owned the rights to the name Bluto, so they could have named him Bluto if they wanted. Oh well, better safe than sorry. And in 1978, CBS King Features and Hanna-Barbera produced a new Popeye series called The All-New Popeye Hour that ran from 1978 to 1983, and they created a total of 101 cartoon segments that aired on Saturday morning cartoons, and the character of Brutus was reverted back to Bluto, and the classic characters of Olive Oyl, Wimpy, Swee'Pea, Poop Deck Pappy, and even the little magical animal, Eugene the Jeep, starred in this cartoon series. And they were actually joined by some new characters, including Popeye's quadruplet nephews. And I remember watching these cartoons on Saturday morning as a kid. Now, the idea for this movie came about when producer Robert Evans wanted to produce a movie based on the hit Broadway musical, Annie. which in turn was actually based on an old comic strip. Robert Evans was an old Hollywood movie producer from the Silver Age of Hollywood, and he sort of typified that second generation of Hollywood movie producers. He was rich, he was handsome, he was a womanizer, he was married 7 times, and he partied hard. He was a heavy drinker, and he did lots and lots of cocaine. In fact, in the movie Wag the Dog, the Hollywood producer that Dustin Hoffman played was a parody of Robert Evans. And Robert Evans was an incredibly successful producer in Hollywood. He produced The Godfather 1 and 2, he produced Rosemary's Baby, Love Story, Harold and Maude, and in 1974 he produced Chinatown, and in 1976 he produced The Marathon Man. He was a big deal in Hollywood. So it was significant that his next project in 1980 was going to be Annie. However, Columbia Pictures also wanted to make the Annie movie, and Columbia Pictures and Paramount began this bidding war for the rights to the Annie Broadway musical. Robert Evans had hopes of turning the old comic strip of Annie into a large Hollywood blockbuster film similar to that of the 1978 Superman the movie. However, Columbia Pictures won the bid, and they eventually turned it into the well-known 1982 film Annie, directed by John Huston, starring Albert Finney, Carol Burnett, Eileen Quinlan, and the rest of the stars.
And that movie has gone on to become a children's classic.
Robert Evans was so disappointed that Paramount lost the rights to Columbia Pictures that they decided they were going to make their own Annie-like musical based on another famous cartoon. Robert Evans held a huge executive meeting at Paramount for their producers to recommend a cartoon property they could turn into a musical to rival Annie. And that's when one Paramount executive raised his hand and reminded them that Paramount owned the rights to Popeye. And this was because they had secured the rights to Popeye back in 1932
with those old Fleischer cartoons. To this day, still own the rights to Popeye. And this is exactly what Robert Evans wanted. Popeye would be his Star Wars. And he was 100% certain that Popeye would be his biggest movie yet. And that's quite a statement considering that this is the man that made Godfather 1 and 2 and Chinatown and The Marathon Man. So Robert Evans was prepared to take a huge swing. Well, spoiler alert, this would not be his biggest hit, but was such a Hollywood disappointment that it completely ruined his winning streak and began to spell the end of Robert Evans in Hollywood. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes. After Popeye, he'd make a series of box office disasters, including The Cotton Club, The Two Jakes, and The Phantom, although 2 of his final movies, the 1997 film The Saint and the 2003 film How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, were both very profitable. Paramount hired award-winning playwright and cartoonist Jules Feiffer, who had gained fame for his 1971 Carnal Knowledge movie starring Jack Nicholson, and they hired him to write an all-out musical for Popeye. Now, Jules Feiffer, aside from being an award-winning screenwriter, had a lot of comic book credibility. Feiffer started his career as an intern to legendary comic book writer and artist Will Eisner, creator of The Spirit. In fact, Will Eisner was such a dominant force in comics in the 1940s and 1950s that to this day, the annual comic book awards are known as the Eisner Awards. Jules Feiffer then got his Hollywood start making animated films. Robert Evans had only one demand of Jules Feiffer. The movie should be an homage to the original Thimble Theater comic strip, not the more recent TV cartoons, which pretty much takes place in a normal suburb. Now, in the original idea, Paramount wanted Dustin Hoffman to play Popeye and Lily Tomlin to be Olive Oyl. And Dustin Hoffman had just worked with Robert Evans in Marathon Man, and he was really interested in playing Popeye. And Hoffman spent many months getting into character and mastering the Popeye voice. However, Dustin Hoffman and screenwriter Jules Feiffer clashed, and it started when Feiffer flew out to New York to meet Dustin Hoffman, and Dustin Hoffman had Feiffer wait 2 days before meeting him. And so while waiting, Feiffer just got drunk and was even tipsy when the two finally met. And apparently the meeting was a huge clash of egos, and they did not get along. And after the meeting, Dustin Hoffman pretty much said that he would not do the movie if Feiffer was involved. And to everyone's shock, Robert Evans sided with Feiffer. And so Dustin Hoffman left the project. Paramount was furious that Dustin Hoffman was gone, and they no longer had a marquee star to market the project, so they threatened to pull financing. However, Robert Evans convinced Paramount that Popeye was such a well-known property and that this project was such a surefire success that they didn't need a marquee star. And at that meeting, Robert Evans apparently told the Paramount top brass, quote, "We can even use that guy, that comedian on TV. I can't remember his name right now," unquote. He was, of course, referring to Robin Williams, who was red hot on the TV show Mork and Mindy.
Now, Robin Williams was born on July 21st, 1951 in Chicago, Illinois, and his father was an executive for Ford Lincoln Mercury, and his mother was a former model. And his great-grandfather was Mississippi Senator and Governor Anselm J. McLaurin. And in high school, Robin Williams was involved in the drama club, and during his graduation, he was voted funniest classmate, but also voted most likely not to succeed. He then attended Claremont Men's College to study political science, but dropped out to pursue acting. And in 1973, Robin Williams received a full scholarship to Juilliard and was classmates with Christopher Reeve, William Hurt, and Mandy Patinkin. And in 1976, he began performing stand-up comedy in California, including The Comedy Store, and was discovered by TV producer George Schlatter, who asked him to appear on Laugh-In. He was then hired as a cast member on The Richard Pryor Show, which led to a 1978 episode of Happy Days titled My Favorite Orkin, where he played an alien named Mork. And William improvised most of his dialogue, and the TV network executives were so impressed with his performance that they created a spin-off show called Mork and Mindy. Robert Evans went to director John Schlesinger, who was red hot after directing Midnight Cowboy, which won 2 Oscars, one for Best Director and one for Best Picture, and they wanted him to make the Popeye movie. However, John Schlesinger turned it down. Then, crazy enough, Robert Altman was hired. Paramount wanted Gilda Radner to play Olive Oyl. However, Robert Altman wanted Shelley Duvall, whom he thought was the splitting resemblance of Olive Oyl. Fortunately, Gilda Radner's agent did not like the Popeye project and begged Gilda Radner not to do it, so she eventually declined the role. Robert Altman was able to cast Shelley Duvall in the role, whom he frequently collaborated with. Shelley Duvall was no stranger to being compared to Olive Oyl. When she was growing up, her classmates used to tease her by calling her Olive Oyl. Shelley Duvall was born on July 7, 1949 in Fort Worth, Texas, and worked at a cosmetics section of Foley's, and then attended South Texas Junior College to become a nutritionist, but dropped out of college after witnessing a monkey vivisection. In Houston, Texas, Shelley Duvall was attending a party for her artist boyfriend, and that party happened to be attended by Robert Altman. And Altman was impressed by her unusual look and her upbeat personality, and assumed she was an actress and asked her to be in his next movie. But she declined because she had no plans to become an actress, so he had to convince her to give it a try. And Altman cast her in his 1970 movie, Brewster McCloud, and she then starred in his 1971 film, McCabe and Mrs. Miller. She then starred in the 1974 film, Thieves Like Us, and his 1975 film, Nashville. And in 1977, she was cast in the Academy Award-winning Woody Allen film, Annie Hall. Shelley Duvall had just wrapped up filming the 1980 film, The Shining, and it was no secret that she was emotionally tortured by director Stanley Kubrick and his method directing in order to get some of her terrified reactions. And by the end of that filming, Shelley Duvall was genuinely traumatized. The set of Popeye was much more relaxed, and Shelley Duvall has gone on to say that she had a fantastic time on the set of Popeye, and she was really able to recover from the emotional trauma of filming The Shining. Furthermore, Shelley Duvall loved how this Olive Oyl was written. In an interview with Roger Ebert, she stated that she was impressed how strong the character of Olive Oyl was, and Duvall stated that Olive Oyl was one of the strongest characters she ever played. Robert Altman decided to go all out and build the live village of Sweethaven. It would be an all-out set on the island of Malta, off the tip of Italy and north of Tunisia in the Mediterranean.
This set of Sweethaven was actually built,
and this town actually exists. Tree trunk logs were driven across the European continent from the Netherlands, and wood shingles were imported all the way from Canada. 8 tons of nails and 2,000 gallons of paint were used to complete the set, and it took 7 months to build. And when they finished, this fictional village of Sweethaven consisted of 19 buildings, including a fully operational hotel, a schoolhouse, a store, a post office, a church, and a tavern, and it even had an operating sawmill.
So why Malta? It seems completely random and in the middle of nowhere. Well, not really, because Malta was emerging as a popular locale for Hollywood to film European sites, and the Maltese government was trying very hard to attract Hollywood productions to film there. In fact, in 1977, the Turkish prison scene in Midnight Express was filmed in Malta. In 1977, the film Orca was filmed in Malta, and in 1981, Clash of the Titans was filmed in Malta. Robert Altman liked Malta because the government was very friendly to Hollywood productions and everything was cheap. Also, the weather would allow year-long filming, although this turned out to work against them because it had an unusual amount of rain that year, and it ended up raining so much that they had to film around the rain. And one of the hopes was that the distance from Hollywood would prevent studio interference. And the second reason was that Robert Altman's directorial style. Altman liked to have his cast be isolated from the outside world and fully immersed in the universe of the movie. His actors would live the movie, and this would often lead to magical moments on screen, and this worked to great success on his movie MASH. So filming in Malta made sense. In fact, since then, Malta has successfully marketed itself as a major filming location, and you may not have realized that many of your favorite movies and TV shows were actually filmed in Malta. The 2000 Gladiator film was filmed in Malta. The 2004 Troy with Brad Pitt as Achilles was filmed in Malta. And in 2013, World War Z, the Israel scenes were filmed in Malta. And the 2022 Jurassic Park Dominion, the Black Market Dinosaur Market, was filmed in Malta. And the majority of Game of Thrones, King's Landing, was shot in Malta. And today, many, many movies are filmed in Malta. And this is the weird part, is that this town actually still exists today. It is a major attraction for Malta, and they apparently turned it into an amusement park as an homage to this movie and to the character of Popeye. And now they have boat rides, they have a Popeye museum, they have actors who walk around dressed as Popeye, Olive Oyl, Wimpy, and Bluto, and you just can't make this up. And in this park, they air the movie Popeye on a continuous loop. It's like this park is actually a really cool legacy of this movie. Many of the actors on this movie began to feel trapped on this little Sweethaven world, and they began to get island fever. Furthermore, the budget began to balloon. Popeye was initially projected to cost about $8 million, and by this time it had already become $13 million, and by the end of the movie, the cost would come in around $20 million, 3 times more than the projected initial budget. The cast had nothing to do on the weekends except party and use drugs. And Robin Williams, who was the essential city boy, was particularly bored on set. And on weekends, he would go to a nearby town in Malta and go into local bars and do free stand-up comedy for the bar's patrons. And that is totally cool. In the original script by Jules Pfeiffer, Popeye eventually finds a magical pet, Eugene the Jeep, from the cartoon. Fans of the cartoon will be familiar with this character. He's the interdimensional yellow cat that has magical and psychic powers. However, the producers thought that Eugene the Jeep was too outrageous, and they really couldn't see how they could make him work using the available technology of 1980. So they decided that Eugene the Jeep had to be removed from the movie. However, they still needed a clairvoyant character for the script, and so they endowed the future predicting powers to the baby Swee'Pea. And that's why Swee'Pea is able to predict who's going to win the horse races. And that's why he has psychic powers that he never had in the cartoons. Now, one of the most accurate factors in this movie are the costumes. Everyone in the movie is dressed exactly like their cartoon counterpart. And the fact that Popeye wears his various outfits, the one he wears that white shirt and blue pants, but he also wears the classic blue shirt with white pants and the red scarf, and so you feel that this movie is just a love letter to Popeye. Now, we can't talk about Popeye without talking about the incredible music, whether you love it or hate it, because the music is another character of its own. And it's crazy that this movie was composed by Harry Nilsson. And if you know who he is, you're probably a huge fan. And if you don't know who he is, you really have no idea who he is. Harry Nilsson's one of those figures where inside the music industry, he is a legend and often referred to as the American Beatle or the American Schubert. In fact, John Lennon cited Harry Nilsson as one of his biggest influences. And Paul McCartney was a huge fan of his, and Ringo Starr was best man at his wedding. So Harry Nilsson is a big deal, and yet most people outside the music industry have no idea who he is. And part of that is the fact that he was very reclusive and the fact that he never toured. And he also had a very dark side to his personality, and if he got mad, he can get really, really mad. So he had this dark reputation in Hollywood. And originally they considered hiring the Broadway music team of Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe, who had written Camelot, My Fair Lady, and Brigadoon, for that classic musical feel. And they also considered hiring the team of John Kander and Fred Ebb, who had written Cabaret, Chicago, and Kiss of the Spider-Woman. And these were very known Broadway writers. However, Robin Williams was a big fan of Harry Nilsson and asked if Robert Altman would consider him for a very different, modern musical feel. And Harry Nilsson was known for having this incredible singing voice and for writing new, very different types of music that often defied categorization. He had written One Is the Loneliest Number, he wrote Everybody's Talkin' for the movie Midnight Cowboy, and he wrote Without You, as well as many, many others. Now, people warned Robert Altman not to hire Harry Nilsson due to his difficult personality and explosive temper. However, Robert Altman never saw that side of him, and for the entire production, Nilsson was kind and professional and delivered an amazing collection of incredible, catchy music. The movie starts out with his first song, Sweethaven, where we see the town under the oppressive rule of the bully, Bluto. And the next song is Everything is Food, which is an interesting song because it's so weird, although the tune is so catchy that once you hear it, it's an earworm that won't leave your brain. So what's the song about? Everything is Food? Well, this song is Nilsson's critique of superficial consumer consumption culture. And so we start the movie with a town stuck in a rut where the people live under an oppressive government of Bluto and the Commodore, and all they enjoy is eating and consuming. They are empty and spiritually bankrupt, and to them, all they know is food. And the town will undergo a character arc with the arrival of Popeye, who will free them of the Commodore and of Bluto, and he'll teach Olive Oyl and the Oyl family and the entire town of Sweethaven how to love and care for each other. The next song is sung by Olive Oyl on the night of her engagement, where we see her justifying her relationship with Bluto. She's about to marry him, but she clearly isn't excited. She can't find anything good to say about him except that he's large, not only in size, but in personality and occupation. He fills up the room with his dominant personality and dominates and bullies a town as its leader. And it is Harry Nilsson, so you have to wonder if there's also a sexual anatomical context intended as well, which, considering her sadness and her plan to leave Bluto, adds a tragic, almost a terrifying factor to her describing him as large. And then we get Bluto, who, upon finding out that Olive Oyl has left him, begins to tear up the Oyl household while proclaiming that he's really, really mean. And it's a fun song. At the horse races, Popeye is outraged that they would exploit his son, and he draws a line in the sand, and he sings, I am what I am, and it's a crazy fun musical number where we see Popeye proclaim who he is and what he's about. And in the background, we see Olive Oyl begin to develop respect for his integrity. The next song is a beautiful and haunting answer to He's Large, which is He Needs Me. Whereas Olive singing He's Large lacked any affection for Bluto, and we saw her trying to justify to herself to marry him and ends up with that song justifying to leave him, here it's the opposite. She slowly realizes that she's falling in love with Popeye, and it's more than just the lyrics. We can feel her love through Nilsson's music, and we begin to understand Nilsson's genius for how to compose songs. The next song, Stay With Me, is a deceptively gentle lullaby that captures the film's emotional core, the longing for connection and stability in a chaotic world. Sung by Olive Oyl and Popeye to their baby Swee'Pea, the song expresses unconditional love and the simple hope that someone will just remain at their side. And while Olive Oyl and Popeye realize their love for Swee'Pea, they also realize their love for each other, and the theme quietly mirrors Popeye's own search for belonging and family. Harry Nilsson's simple, almost fragile melody underscores the sincerity of the moment, avoiding sentimentality while emphasizing vulnerability. Stay With Me pauses everything, grounding Popeye in a tender human desire to be loved, protected, and not left alone. And then we get a nice lullaby that Popeye sings Swee'Pea after Bluto has kidnapped him, and he's just so worried for him as his father. And you sense Popeye's heartbreak, and he just wants Swee'Pea to be okay. And you feel him becoming a father. And then we get Ray Walston's Poop Deck Pappy singing Kids, a comedic rant about the uselessness of children. And the song is ironic in that this is the moment where Poop Deck Pappy admits that he's Popeye's father, and is emotionally hurt that his feelings aren't reciprocated. And apparently Ray Walston had a very difficult time singing the rapid-fire lyrics of the song, but he eventually got through it. And the movie closes with Popeye singing the classic, I'm Popeye, the Sailor Man. What an incredible, fun selection of songs. Now, one of the problems that the movie had was the big Popeye forearms. An American special effects company created inflatable giant forearms for Robin Williams that were made of silicone rubber. But they didn't work properly, and Robin Williams could not move his arms while wearing them. And there was an even worse problem. It didn't look convincing on screen. Apparently, it looked like he was wearing giant gardening gloves. Therefore, they went to an Italian company to redesign the forearms. The forearms were built with accurate anatomical structure, and little old Italian women individually sewed hairs onto the arms to make it look even more real. Robin Williams was very impressed by how well the arms looked. However, these forearms were incredibly uncomfortable for Robin Williams, and they cut off the circulation to his arms. But unfortunately for Robin Williams, the forearms really looked convincing on camera, which meant that they were going to be used. In fact, if you look at this movie, the forearms do look pretty good. However, Robin Williams could only tolerate the forearms for about 10 minutes before his hands would go numb and turn blue. Therefore, they had to put on the forearms, film about 10 minutes, and then take them off for Williams to recover his circulation, then put them back on for another 10 minutes of filming before his arms went numb again. And it caused a lot of delays in filming, but that was the only way they can get the footage. Now remember, Robin Williams loved to improvise and ad-lib, and this conflicted with Altman, who insisted that Williams stick to the script. And this caused a lot of tension between Williams and Altman. After filming the movie, much of Popeye's dialogue came out as inaudible mumbles, and so Robin Williams had to re-record all of Popeye's dialogue in post. In the opening prologue scene, we get a cartoon Popeye who is voiced by Jack Mercer, who originally voiced Popeye in the 1960s animated television series. Jack Mercer was 70 years old at the time and came out of retirement to voice this quick segment at the beginning of the film. The movie starts out with our protagonist Popeye arriving at the village of Sweethaven, and he's searching for his missing father. He rents a room at the Oyls family boarding house, where the Oyls plan to have their daughter Olive marry Captain Bluto, a powerful, perpetually angry bully who manages a town in the name of the mysterious Commodore. Now, at a bar, Popeye is attacked by a group of thugs, and they are Spike, Mort, Gazzo, Bolo, Slug, and Butch, and these characters are actually from the comic strip. In the Thimble Theater strip, Popeye has fought every one of these bullies. The night of the engagement party, Olive sneaks out after discovering that the only attribute she can use to describe Bluto is that he's large.
And he's large.
And while sneaking out of town, she encounters Popeye, who has failed to fit in with the townsfolk at the party. And the two find an abandoned baby in a basket, and Popeye and Olive adopt the child, naming him Swee'Pea after the town of Sweethaven, and the three return to the Oyls' home. The character of Swee'Pea was played by Robert Altman's own grandson, and Altman had an ulterior motive in casting him. He had had a falling out with his daughter, and by casting her son, she was forced to be in Malta with Altman, and the two were able to bond and reconnect. And the character of Bluto crushes a character who was supposed to be Harold Hamgravy, who was Olive Oyl's boyfriend when Thimble Theater first premiered in the comic strip. So in the backstory of this movie, he and Olive Oyl may have briefly dated many years ago. Meanwhile, Bluto realizes that he's been stood up for his engagement and slowly begins to tear up the Oyl household. And when he sees Olive Oyl and Popeye with a baby, all Bluto can see is red, and he beats up Popeye and destroys the house. The next day, Bluto, with the backing of the powerful Commodore, levies a heavy tax on the Oyl household, and Castor Oyl enters a boxing contest against Oxblood Oxheart in order to raise money for the household, but he's unsuccessful. Popeye enters the fight and beats Oxblood and wins the money for the Oyl family. And here we get Linda Hunt in one of her first movie roles as Mrs. Oxheart, Oxblood's mother. Incidentally, Oxblood Oxheart is a character from the Thimble Theater comic strip. The next day, Popeye discovers that Swee'Pea can predict the future by whistling when he hears the correct answer to a question.
Swee'Pea, will Popeye actually survive?
Yeah, survive.
What?
Yeah.
You mean he'll win? Oh.
That's a neat trick.
And Wimpy, the constantly hungry burger-loving local mooch and petty gambler, also notices this and asks Popeye and Olive if he can take Swee'Pea for a walk, and takes him to the horse races and wins 2 bets. Hearing of this, Olive and her family decide to get in on the action and uses Swee'Pea to win, but an outraged Popeye sings, "I am what I am," and takes Swee'Pea away.
Popeye the sailor, and Popeye the sailor.
Popeye throws the taxman into the sea and becomes a hero of the town, but Wimpy kidnaps Swee'Pea at Bluto's orders, and that evening when Olive Oyl checks in on Popeye privately, she overhears him lamenting that Swee'Pea deserves to have 2 parents, and that he regrets leaving the way he did. The next morning, Wimpy informs Popeye about the kidnapping after being threatened by Olive, and Popeye goes to the Commodore's ship where he learns that the Commodore
who's been tied up by Bluto, is indeed his father, Poop Deck Pappy, who accepts that Popeye is a son after exposing Popeye's hatred of spinach. And Poop Deck Pappy was brilliantly played by Ray Walston, who was famous at that time as the alien Uncle Martin in the TV show My Favorite Martian, which ran from 1963 to 1966. And this role was one of Ray Walston's attempts to escape the typecasting of being Uncle Martin. However, it wouldn't be until 1982 with the film Fast Times at Ridgemont High where Ray Walston would play the high school teacher, Mr. Han, where a whole new generation would become Ray Walston fans. Bluto kidnaps Olive and sets sail with her and Swee'Pea to find the buried treasure promised by Poop Deck Pappy. Popeye, Pappy, Wimpy, and the Oyl family board Pappy's ship to chase Bluto to a desolate island in the middle of the ocean called Scab Island. And for the finale of the movie, Robert Altman envisioned a spectacular fight between Bluto and Popeye. As they're battling each other, this huge ship would sink. Unfortunately, they completely ran out of money. Robert Altman had spent most of the budget of the film on building the town of Sweethaven on the front end, and they really ran out of budget by the end of the movie. And Robert Evans really refused to give them any more money. After all, this was originally supposed to be an $8 million movie whose budget had ballooned to $13 million and was now at $20 million. Robert Evans was not happy with Altman, so instead they had to settle for this cheap-looking rubber octopus, and instead of an all-out battle, they had to settle on Bluto swimming away, having turned yellow with fear. And knowing they made this ending at the last minute, having run out of money, it kind of makes sense that you can see how they really poo-pooed the ending. Popeye catches up to Bluto and fights him, but he's no match for Bluto's powerful strength. And during the fight, Pappy recovers his treasure and opens the chest to reveal a collection of personal sentimental items from Popeye's infancy, including a few cans of spinach. Salty Sam, a giant octopus, awakens and attacks Olive Oyl from under the water, and Pappy saves Swee'Pea from a similar fate. With Popeye in a chokehold from Bluto, Pappy throws him a can of spinach. However, Ray Walston threw the can of spinach. It really hit Robin Williams on the head and cut his forehead, and he had to go to the hospital, thus delaying filming for 2 weeks. Now, recognizing that Popeye hates spinach, Bluto force feeds it to him and lets him sink into the water. However, the spinach empowers Popeye and gives him a powerful boost of strength, and he levels Bluto with one giant punch and then pummels a giant octopus with a series of powerful punches, tying him in knots and throwing him into the sky. Popeye celebrates his victory and his newfound appreciation of spinach while Bluto swims off, having literally turned yellow. And what makes this movie great is that Robert Altman completely takes the source material seriously. You get completely engrossed in this world of Sweethaven, and I was completely invested in these crazy cartoon characters. And in the hands of a lesser director, this would come across like a bad joke. Now, unfortunately, this film was wrought with production problems, and there was even apparently multiple clashes between producer Robert Evans and director Robert Altman, and apparently the two almost came to blows a few times. Now, in one incident, Robert Evans was visiting Malta to inspect the movie, and he brought along a briefcase full of cocaine. Now, it's not known if this was for personal use or to share with the cast and crew. However, his luggage got lost at the airport. And if the Malta authorities were to find out what was in the suitcase, it could have been disastrous for Robert Evans and for the reputation of this family-friendly movie. Well, Robert Evans brought out the big guns. He was friends with Henry Kissinger, who got involved and helped Robert Evans find the luggage, and the Malta authorities never learned what was in the suitcase. Ironically, in a separate incident, during the filming of Popeye, Robert Evans was arrested in an FBI cocaine bust where he and his brother Charles Evans was arrested buying a large amount of cocaine, and he pled guilty to a misdemeanor, and as part of the plea, he had to film an anti-drug TV commercial. The movie was finally completed, and Paramount and Disney were pleased with what they saw, so they decided to spend an extra $10 million marketing the film. And the film garnered mixed reviews. However, many critics like Roger Ebert loved the film, and he gave the film 3.5 out of 4 stars, and he called the movie lots of fun and called it sophisticated entertainment. In fact, both Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert gave the film 2 thumbs up. Now, in terms of box office, it's very interesting because it was made on a budget of $20 million, but worldwide it ended up making $60 million at the box office, which meant that it was a solid, profitable film, recouping its costs and making a substantial profit. However, the producers really had high expectations that this would turn into a major musical franchise, and they officially categorized it as a flop. And today it is unfairly considered a Hollywood disaster, which really I think is unfair, because it's simply wrong. This movie made a substantial profit. But time has been very kind to this movie. Today, many people who grew up with this film call it a cult favorite. Filmmakers like Paul Thomas Anderson cites this movie as one of his favorites and even put the Shelley Duvall song He Needs Me in his Punch Drunk Love movie. Another fan of this movie is the Academy Award-winning director Phil Lord, who claims that watching Popeye helped inspire the techniques used in the Lego movie. Now, probably the greatest legacy to come out of this movie is that it starred Robin Williams, down the road with what would be a solid movie career. And here we can see that Robin Williams is more than just a comedian, but he really has the charisma, the sweetness, and the pathos to be able to draw an audience in and carry an entire film. And from here, he's going to have an incredible meteoric rise, from Good Morning Vietnam to Aladdin to Mrs. Doubtfire to The Birdcage and to Good Will Hunting and many, many more. So are you a fan of this movie? Did you watch it when you were a kid? Let me know what you think of the movie in the comments below. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.